This is episode 5 of the Equity East Midlands branch podcast. This is our 5th of 16 episodes that we're going to talk about Spotlight. Deja vu, if you've listened to episode 4. So join us as we reflect on the importance of equity through our lens of lived experience. We have Mel Parker, is a voice artist with a home studio here in the East Midlands. Ken Ogborn is an actor living in the region. Kim Gillespie, the chair, welcome. Let's talk about Spotlight. Again.
Yes.
Kim, you had some really good insights as we were trying to talk before this episode.
The judgment, we're kind of picking it up. I mean, to a certain extent, we have to be a bit circumspect in terms of the judgment because it's been published, but there's also a kind of legal appeal that Equity have launched because the judgment didn't go our way. Now, there was a number of reasons that were cited in the judgment, some of which, again, I can't really go into because it's kind of sub judice, so to speak. But, you know, I mean, my conclusions, let's start with that. I mean, I think it showed that the judge didn't really understand the professional world that we live in. And you mentioned earlier about the lived experience, Caron. Clearly, it's not her lived experience. But our lived experience is that Spotlight, you know, is there, and it's absolutely crucial and necessary, and agents insist on it, you know, and none of that seemed to figure in the judgment in terms of the real world that we live in. She really didn't understand that aspect of it and accepted basically that it wasn't a work finding service, and nor were the additional services part of that work finding service. So, you know, I mean, that's kind of pretty crucial. I'm interested to see what Ken and Mel think about this, but I see that as an essential misunderstanding of the way we live our lives in the profession, isn't it?
Yeah, I think for me that was disappointing. Well, quite simply disappointing, wasn't it? That you'd have thought, given, I assume, the length of time that was taken through the process to explain the profession, that kind of fundamental part of it was going to be the easy bit, so to speak. That, you know, understanding kind of how things worked in reality. So yeah, really disappointing that the mark was totally missed, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. They don't appreciate the monopolistic position that Spotlight has. And I think, like, any apportionment of justice should start with understanding that monopolistic nature of Spotlight. We've talked before about how sites where you advertise goods, services, or products can have monopolistic positions. And this is regularly challenged, for example, in the US legal system and in the European legal system, that they regularly recognize that although there is no compulsion, for example, to use Google as your search engine, Google effectively has a monopoly on search. And so I think legally, although Spotlight is not mandated as the only portal through which actors can find work, in effect and practice, it is the only portal through which actors can find work.
Yeah. I mean, again, it comes back to this lived experience thing. We kind of that to us, that's the kind of the real world. But the other thing that they came up with, I think, was that they thought it was a change of policy, and they didn't recognise. They thought it was a campaigning change of policy rather than something that had happened with the union vis-a-vis Spotlight over many years. So they kind of almost denigrated it, really, or certainly undervalued the nature of this legal case because it had sprung out of activism, so to speak. But, you know, I mean, I don't know, Caron, you had a kind of perspective on that, which is a bit more historical than mine, because I kind of hadn't paid attention for the past 15 years or so.
It's an interesting journey because Spotlight and Equity were very much hand in hand for a long time. And I think all institutions and all organisations that have a management structure that is employed to look after the wider business does come and go and changes, and you have friendships that get built and you have allegiances amongst businesses. But with Equity being a members-led institution, a lot of the members don't understand the nuances and diplomacy that have gone on within the managerial layer. Okay. And I think over the last 5 years especially, there's been a huge shift in Equity's leadership.
Yeah.
And I think that leadership...
And Spotlight's ownership as well.
And Spotlight's ownership, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that change has created a very different world, especially the world that we live in at the moment anyway, where, you know, members need to either find work, and Spotlight is a big part of, do you pay for Equity membership or do you pay for Spotlight? And there's kind of a parity in cost in some ways, but there isn't really a parity in benefits, but they are very different benefits. And I know for a long time Equity tried to create a members directory where you could put all of your Spotlight on, you could put all the membership that you were on, you could say who you were, you could put show reels on there. The problem was no one used it. And where Spotlight have the benefit is that they have two sides of a coin. So you've got one side of the coin that is Spotlight, that is the actors directory, a way of putting yourself out there, a way of an agent saying, I have these credible people on my books. But the flip side of the coin, that it is a tool for agents. You know, agents rarely use other locations than Spotlight to find their talent. I think, you know, when we've been talking about what does this mean for the industry, you know, understanding our industry, it's always had a few little quirks that have been ironed out over the years, whether it's inland revenue and our work status, or whether it's our contractual status, or whether it's paid freelance or paid employment. And then just the directory nature, how do you find where people are? Because Spotlight used to be this big set of directories that you would go into a venue and they would be lined up across a bookshelf. And one of my first jobs as a stage manager, as an ASM, was to go through the cast list, go through the Spotlight and photocopy out the actors' photos so they could be pinned up in stage door, so that we all knew who was in the cast when they turned up. So, you know, they first day of rehearsals, we knew who all of the actors were. But there was never a time that I went through Spotlight and didn't find somebody. They were just, everybody was there. So that directory and that credibility and authority, and then talent and the agents. So just where does the directories fall for you guys? Because as I say, Mel, you're working in voice, Ken in the acting sector, and Kim, you've got experience of directing. So, you know, what directories, how do you find work elsewhere if Spotlight is not the de facto, the legal case says that it is? Where else do you go?
Well, I think I said in the previous episode that in the voice world, I mean, most certainly people are on Spotlight, particularly if you're an actor, but it's not the directory that actually you would say is top of the list. Right. I'm not on Spotlight, been voicing for 13 years. But there are equivalent directories, so to speak, some of which out there are free that you can get yourself on, and some of which are subscription based in a very similar way. And so we were watching from a voice industry's angle with interest, because, you know, depending on the outcome of the case would raise questions for these directory people call them the pay to play sites. You pay for a subscription to put your own profile on there with your voice reels, and B, to have access to auditions, so people can search. Directors would go on and search for, I need this type of voice in this accent, you know, British female, so on and so forth, and you would be invited to audition in the same way. And then obviously there's your marketing. It's slightly different in the voice world.
Quickly, Ken and Kim, we've come to the end of our wonderfully short 10 minutes. This subject is not going to go away. I think how we find work, whether it's Spotlight, whether we feature some other platforms to help people who are listening to the podcasts to maybe find some of their own work. So, Ken, Kim, final words.
Well, we have to wait and see. Sorry, Ken, you carry on.
No, I was just going to say, I think my impression has been that the judge actually did not do enough fact finding on this.
No.
And that they've made their judgment from a position of ignorance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my point exactly, and also paying far too much attention to Spotlight's case, in terms of the kind of cliche stuff and the patter that they gave, which we all know in terms of what they do. They're not this, they're not that. As Ken said on the previous episode, in that case, they're not very good, are they? If if their case is reliant on the things that they don't do. But we'll have to wait and see. We'll see what happens when the case comes up.
All of the articles that have been published on the Equity website, I will put in the show notes. Go and listen to episode 4 of how we felt before it happened, and listening to this podcast now that you have heard where we're at the moment. And join us for episode 6.